welcome back everybody to another video. In this video we're going to give you a quick comparison between the Xbox Series X and the Xbox One X. Now, we all know that the Xbox Series X is going to be more beefier because it's new components, new hardware, so by default it's going to be more powerful, and it's going to be a little bit better in every department, as it should be with an upgrade. But in this video I'm pretty much going to give you guys a couple main key points, difference between those two, and wrap it up with the main feature, which is my input and insight on the 120 hertz aspect of these two consoles, because those who are the Xbox One X owners are pretty much wondering if it's even worth it to jump into the Series X. So I'm just gonna give you guys my experience with it, and if you guys want to know the specs, you can also look that up, because this is more of an insight video with the comparison. So on the Xbox Series X, we know that the main feature of this console for gaming is that it is native 4K at 120 hertz with HDR10 or Dolby Vision, and that's for gaming. On the Xbox One X, the main feature is native 4K at 60 hertz with HDR10. And if you want to run 120 hertz, it's going to be native 1440p at 120 hertz with no HDR for the Xbox One X. Now, a couple of differences between these two. The Xbox Series X has no optical port. The Xbox One X has an optical port. The design on both consoles are good in my eyes, but that's subjective. They are both backwards compatible, so no problems there. Now, as far as 4K movies go on these two consoles, they're pretty much on par. They're pretty much the same. They both look good. They sound good, because the surround sound on both consoles is identical. It has the same capabilities, so it's pretty much on par with each other on that. And if you want to know about the resolution and graphics, it's going to be a tiny bit better depending on your TV too, but on of course the Xbox Series X. But the important thing is that what's up with the 120 hertz. So of course, before we go to that, actually, so when you game in 4K at 60 hertz on the Xbox Series X, it feels like 4K at 60 frames per second. But when you play games on the Xbox One X, when you have the settings on 4K at 60 hertz, it feels, the way it moves, it's gonna feel like 4K at 30 frames per second. Now, in order to utilize your Xbox One X as far as frame rate go, you're gonna have to uncheck your 4K, so you can run. You have to force 1440p at 120 hertz, so that you can get the best frames per second response on the Xbox One X. I'll say it again. So for the Xbox One X, when you're gaming at 4K at 60 hertz, it moves like 4K at 30 frames per second. So in order to get at least 60 frames per second, or the feeling of it, you're gonna have to force your console to run 1440p at 120 hertz, and by doing that you have to uncheck the 4K, and when you do that you'll get no HDR, but when you play a game, it'll feel at least 60 frames per second on the Xbox One X. Now, on the Xbox Series X, you don't have to uncheck anything. You can leave every box checked, the settings checked, and it will run everything at 120 hertz with HDR. Unless you want to run like HDR Dolby Vision, then you'll have that won't be 120 hertz. But as far as gaming goes, when you run native 4K at 60 hertz on the Xbox Series X, you are running 4K. It will feel like 4K at 60 frames per second, and then when you run games at 4K at 120 hertz, it will feel like native 4K at 120 frames per second for the games that support 120 frames per second. And of course, on the Xbox Series X, they have a feature called Boost Mode, which will optimize the frames per second on that certain games that are equipped for it. On the Xbox One X, pretty much right now, there's no indication for support on 120 frames per second on any game. But basically, even though you can set the Xbox One X to force it to run 120 frames per second with no HDR, particularly, there's no indication or support for that extra game. So for instance, for example, Gears 5 on the Xbox Series X supports 120 frames per second because the devs say that, and when you go into the game, there's an option to turn that game settings to 120 frames per second or 120 hertz, which you know that the game is shooting for 120 hertz or 120 frames per second on the Xbox Series X. Same game, Gears 5 on the Xbox One X, there will be no indication in the game that you're running 120 hertz in the option. On top of that, the developers don't state that it's actually supported for 120 frames per second on the Xbox One X for the same game. So the main difference that is important between the Xbox Series X and the Xbox One X is the fact that if you want to run 120 hertz on your gaming, there's really no support or indication that you're running 120 hertz for that particular game that is supported on the Xbox Series X side. On top of that, if you're running a 60 hertz game, it doesn't feel like you're running 60 frames per second, but on the Xbox Series X, it does feel like 60 frames per second. So that's very important to note with the difference between those two. And on the Xbox One X, to run 120 hertz, you're gonna have to force 120 hertz to run or to be in that option, and then you'll get no HDR, and even then it's not really supported by the actual game itself. But like I said, on the Xbox Series X, you don't have to uncheck anything. You can leave all the options on there, and it will, for the games that is optimized, it will go to that settings. Now, the only time, the only thing that you might want to uncheck on the Xbox Series X is if you want to run Dolby Vision for gaming on that particular game that supports it, you might have to uncheck the Dolby Vision if you want to run 120 hertz, because most of the games as of right now, if you run Dolby Vision, it don't necessarily support 120 frames per second if you're running Dolby Vision. So if you want to run Dolby Vision for gaming on the Xbox Series X, you pretty much have to be in HDR10. So that's just a note on that side. that's neither here or there. So I hope that clears up some things on between these two consoles. And me personally, I don't believe that the Xbox One X is obsolete. But if you were to ask the question, if you were being an Xbox One X owner, should you upgrade to Xbox Series X? Yes, definitely. You should definitely upgrade to Xbox Series X because of what I just mentioned. Um, it's gonna be your graphics fidelity is gonna be a lot better. On top of that, you're pretty much supported for 100 frames per second. And even games that are not supported for 120 frames per second, you have boost mode, which will optimize your frames per second on that particular game that from way back when. So that is pretty much the comparison between these two consoles. And I hope you guys learned something. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Hooded Dragons out.